In the heart of ancient Rome, long before his name became a curse, a young emperor began shaping a kingdom around his darkest desires. Behind the marble columns and triumphal arches, another Rome existed. One ruled not by law, but by fear, indulgence, and an appetite for domination no advisor dared restrain. This is the story of how a boy raised in poison became an emperor forged in cruelty, and how Rome learned too late what monster it had crowned. In 54 AD, when Nero ascended the imperial throne at the age of 17, Rome celebrated as though the gods themselves had granted the empire a gentler future. The young emperor appeared charming, educated, and unscarred by the brutal politics that had consumed his predecessors. Yet beneath the carefully polished surface lay a boy shaped by manipulation, ambition, and a quiet craving for control that had been nurtured long before he wore the laurel. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, had engineered every step of his rise. She had whispered into the ears of generals, bribed senators, and removed potential rivals with the cold efficiency of a seasoned predator. Nero grew up watching her bend powerful men to her will, learning early that authority was not inherited, it was seized. From her, he absorbed the language of dominance, the art of silent threats, and the belief that cruelty was simply another instrument of power. But the boy who watched her also feared her, and fear, in the imperial palace, had a way of mutating into darker forms of ambition. During the first months of his reign, Nero attempted to project an image of youthful benevolence. He reduced taxes, spoke softly in the Senate, and attended public games with an approachable smile that made citizens believe Rome had finally escaped the shadows of Caligula and Claudius. Yet inside the palace, a different Nero was awakening. Alone in the imperial corridors late at night, he wandered through torchlit halls decorated with the faces of emperors whose reigns had ended in betrayal. Their hollow eyes reminded him of the fragility of power and the necessity of protecting it through any means. Whispers among palace servants spoke of the emperor's private fascinations. He would summon musicians to play through the night, then abruptly demand silence. He observed wrestlers train, not to admire their skill, but to study the expressions of men forced to struggle under another's command. He watched animal handlers discipline their beasts with a mixture of brutality and tenderness, learning how domination could be disguised as affection. These were small things, quiet curiosities, but together they revealed a mind slowly leaning toward darker obsessions. Seneca, his tutor, tried to guide him toward philosophy and restraint, hoping to shape him into a ruler who governed with reason. But Nero listened with half an ear, absorbing only the pieces that fed his self-image. He preferred the theatrical, the dramatic, the overwhelming. Simple governance bored him. Spectacle intrigued him. The applause of crowds stirred a hunger within him, far more intoxicating than the dull routines of statecraft. The early court soon became divided between those who believed Nero could still be molded and those who sensed the turbulence forming beneath his calm exterior. Among the latter were the palace guards, who noticed how the young emperor's gaze lingered too long on subordinates who displeased him, as though imagining the punishments he could command. Even Agrippina herself, who had crafted Nero with her own hands, began to realize she had created a ruler who might one day try to eclipse her. Rome continued celebrating its youthful emperor, unaware that the foundations of something far more sinister were taking shape. For beneath Nero's gentle reforms and public charm grew a quiet, relentless desire, the desire to surround himself with spaces, people, and pleasures entirely under his command. A desire that, in time, would consume the empire itself. When the Great Fire consumed Rome in 64 AD, its devastation carved a wound across the empire, unlike anything seen in living memory. Entire districts smoldered for days, temples collapsed into ash, and thousands wandered the streets stunned and homeless. Yet amid the grief and ruin, one figure walked the charred remains with unsettling calm: Emperor Nero, surveying the destruction as though it were a blank canvas awaiting his hand. Rumors spread almost instantly, whispers that Nero had watched the flames from a private tower, comparing the burning city to a tragic play. Whether truth or slander, the belief hardened into certainty when he announced his grand vision, the construction of the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It would not be a palace in the traditional sense, but a world unto itself, a sprawling empire within the empire, where every stone, every corridor, every chamber reflected Nero's desires. The design exceeded anything Rome had ever imagined. Architects were commanded to erase the previous boundaries of Roman modesty and build as though constructing a temple for a living deity. Gold leaf, precious stones, towering colonnades, artificial lakes, gardens that imitated distant continents, all were planned without restraint. The project devoured land once belonging to ordinary citizens, and those same citizens watched in silence as the emperor claimed the ashes of their former homes for his own paradise. But behind the official blueprints lay another vision, one Nero revealed only to a select circle of builders sworn to secrecy. These plans depicted more than opulence. They detailed hidden rooms carved behind false walls, sunken chambers without exits, and hallways designed to muffle sound. Spaces that were not meant to be admired, but used. Slaves and laborers noticed unusual instructions. They were ordered to dig deeper, reinforce certain areas with unnecessary thickness, and construct narrow passageways that led nowhere. Some whispered that the emperor wanted rooms where voices could scream without escaping. Others claimed that sections of the palace were sealed before even being completed. A few workers disappeared entirely, their names scratched off payroll lists with quiet efficiency. Nero visited the site regularly, not as a ruler checking progress, but as an artist inspecting a personal masterpiece. He touched the unfinished walls with a strange intimacy, tracing their surfaces as if imagining the people who would one day stand trembling inside them. He spoke to architects about illumination, demanding that certain rooms never receive natural light. He obsessed over acoustics, testing how footsteps or murmured words echoed through narrow stone channels. To observers, his fascination appeared artistic. Yet to those closest to the project, it became clear that Nero was creating more than a palace. He was building a controlled world where pleasure and punishment would exist under his command, hidden from the eyes of Rome. As construction accelerated, the contrast between Rome's misery and Nero's indulgence grew unbearable. Families still searching for lost relatives watched wagons transport gold and marble past their ruined homes. While the poor fought for bread, Nero imported exotic animals for the decorative menageries of the Golden House. Hunger gnawed at the city while luxuries flooded into the emperor's new domain. But the emperor did not care for appearances. He believed the palace was his destiny, a monument to the divine form he saw reflected in himself. And as the Domus Aurea rose, so too did Nero's confidence. The boy still learning to rule began shedding restraint, replacing it with an unshakable conviction that Rome existed for his pleasure alone. The foundations of the Golden House were laid in ash, but its purpose was forged in Nero's escalating hunger for control. A hunger that would soon turn from architecture to the people themselves. As the Domus Aurea neared completion, Nero's attention shifted from marble walls to the individuals who would inhabit them. A palace of such vast ambition, he believed, required more than decoration. It required people who reflected his power. And so began a quiet campaign of selection across the empire. Not for administrators or scholars, but for what Nero called ornaments of living beauty. From Rome's noble households came daughters whose reputations for grace made them suitable for imperial notice. They were summoned under the guise of cultural patronage or artistic admiration, accompanied by families too intimidated to decline. Only a few returned home, and those who did carried eyes hollowed by experiences they refused to recount. Most were absorbed into the palace, renamed, repositioned, and stripped of their former identities with chilling efficiency. Foreign envoys learned quickly that a gift of captives or attendants pleased the emperor more than any treaty. Hostages taken during campaigns in the east or from rebellious provinces were quietly diverted from public slavery into the private halls of the Golden House. Nero favored youthful faces, soft features, or unusual cultural traits, anything that marked a person as collectible. Beauty, innocence, vulnerability, these were the currencies he valued most. Inside the Domus Aurea, the chosen were assigned roles that blurred the boundaries between servitude and spectacle. Some were instructed to attend feasts dressed in ceremonial costumes that reduced them to decorative symbols. Others became attendants in Nero's private chambers, expected to respond to his demands without hesitation. Failure, hesitation, or even an expression of discomfort invited swift punishment. Yet the most disturbing transformations happened behind sealed doors in the palace's hidden sections. Individuals who displeased Nero or who showed signs of emotional resistance were reassigned to chambers where they were denied contact with the outside world. Their names were erased from palace records, replaced with titles that reduced them to functions: the Lydian, the attendant of the South Hall, the silent companion. In these confined spaces, the human spirit deteriorated, not through physical torture, but through enduring uncertainty, control, and isolation. Rumors seeped into Rome's upper circles. At feasts, senators whispered cautiously about women who vanished after attending imperial gatherings, or young men who had been sent to Nero's performances but never returned. No one dared confront the emperor directly. Even a hint of disapproval could be interpreted as treason. The Senate's silence enabled Nero's darkness to grow unchecked. One senator's wife, known for her beauty, was summoned to the palace for what was described as a private musical rehearsal. When she failed to return after several days, her husband approached the palace gates, trembling, desperate for answers. He was denied entry, informed simply that the emperor had taken a personal interest in the matter. Within a week, the senator himself was accused of corruption and exiled. He never learned what became of his wife, though some claim to have seen a figure resembling her walking the shaded garden paths of the Golden House, head bowed, eyes vacant. Nero's court officials adapted quickly to his desires. Overseers created selection lists, cataloging individuals by attributes Nero might find pleasing or useful. Some were chosen to amuse him with music or movement. Others were chosen simply because he enjoyed observing the discomfort of nobility forced into servitude. Each new addition to the palace reinforced Nero's belief that he was not merely emperor, but a living god with dominion over the bodies and identities of his subjects. By the time Rome realized the scale of what the Golden House contained, it was too late. The palace had become a labyrinth filled with the emperor's chosen victims, not of a tyrant's rage, but of his insatiable need for dominance. Nero's night banquets were not ordinary feasts. They were choreographed displays of dominance in which food, music, and luxury served merely as curtains hiding something darker. Guests entered beneath glowing torches as servants scattered petals across marble floors. Laughter echoed, cups overflowed, and the emperor welcomed Rome's most powerful men as though they were cherished companions. But every man who crossed the threshold felt the same cold truth settle into his bones. The evening belonged to Nero's whims, not to civility, not to dignity, and certainly not to them. The senators, once guardians of the Republic's legacy, sat like schoolchildren awaiting instruction. Nero positioned them in full view of the main platform, forcing them into the role of audience for spectacles crafted to unsettle. A captured performer might be brought forward, bound with ornamental chains, and displayed as though part of an exotic tableau. Nero would rise, cup in hand, and narrate the scene with theatrical flourish, gauging each man's reaction with predatory interest. A smile at the wrong moment, or hesitation where enthusiasm was required, could alter a man's fortunes within a single heartbeat. The emperor's cruelty grew more sophisticated with each banquet. He delighted in reversing hierarchies, assigning commands meant to test obedience. A father of noble lineage could be ordered to serve wine to an enslaved entertainer. A decorated general might be compelled to dance clumsily while Nero applauded with exaggerated delight. Humiliation became a ritual, its purpose no longer amusement but domination. The line between entertainment and punishment blurred until neither could be distinguished. Guests learned quickly that silence was safety. Laughter risked insult, disapproval risked death. so they mastered the art of expressionless admiration. They clapped when Nero wanted noise, they drank when he raised his cup, and they forced their eyes to remain steady even when the displays turned grotesque. The emperor seemed to draw vitality from their discomfort, treating it as another delicacy served at his table. At times, he introduced competitive performances between bound individuals, mock contests designed to mask suffering as sport. Senators were commanded to act as judges, their verdicts shaping the punishments that followed. Their participation made them unwilling accomplices in Nero's cruelty. He corrupted their authority by involving them in acts they privately despised yet publicly endorsed. The more they feared him, the more he controlled them. The more he controlled them, the more he enjoyed their fear. Rumors spread beyond the palace walls. Servants who slipped away whispered of chambers where the humiliation deepened, where even senators' wives were not safe from being summoned, displayed, or belittled for the emperor's amusement. Households began to fracture under the weight of suspicion and shame, yet no one dared confront Nero. To be invited to these banquets was dangerous. To be excluded was often worse. The banquets served a deeper function than indulgence. They became instruments of political conditioning. Nero reshaped Rome's social order by demonstrating that status meant nothing before imperial will. A man's honor, built over decades, could be shattered in moments under torchlight. Senators once feared for their careers. Now they feared for their identities, their families, their lives. In these feasts, Rome witnessed the transformation of a ruler into a tyrant. And in the forced silence of those nights, the empire began to lose not just its dignity, but its very sense of what power should be. Hidden deep within the sprawling expanse of the Domus Aurea lay a sanctuary Nero proudly called his secret garden. To the casual eye, it appeared divine, an artificial Eden crafted with jeweled fountains, imported trees, and perfumed breezes carried by cleverly concealed vents. But those who knew its purpose whispered another name, the Garden of Captives. Only the emperor and the unfortunate souls chosen to entertain him understood what truly grew there. The pathways were designed to confuse. Every turn revealed something breathtaking, an illusion crafted to disarm the senses and lower defenses. Painted night skies glimmered above, mechanical birds released their hollow songs, ponds glowed with tinted oils. Nero wandered through this paradise like a god surveying his creation, delighted not by beauty, but by power. Beauty was merely the cage, power was the chain. Within this garden lived individuals Nero handpicked from across the empire. Some were poets with gentle voices, others dancers trained from childhood, others simple slaves whose misfortune was catching Nero's eye. Here, they were not guests or performers, but exotic ornaments meant to reflect the emperor's fantasies. They dressed in delicate fabrics, moved gracefully wherever commanded, and learned to smile even when fear tightened their chests. Nero enforced roles with an artist's cruelty. One youth was made to mimic a woodland faun, horned and silent, expected to leap at Nero's gestures. A noblewoman captured during a political dispute was forced into the role of a living nymph, hidden among vines until Nero summoned her for amusement. Violating these roles, even unintentionally invited consequences disguised as spectacles. Punishment in the secret garden never appeared as punishment. It was theatrical correction, as Nero called it. If a dancer faltered, she might be placed upon a rotating platform, forced to spin endlessly while musicians played cheerful tunes. If a slave broke character, Nero might have him displayed near a fountain, bound in flowering vines to appear like a tragic statue from a myth. Guests who occasionally visited these scenes never saw bruises or tears, they saw art and were expected to praise it. The emperor blurred the boundaries between nature and domination with disturbing precision. He staged mock hunts in which enslaved individuals, adorned with feathers or animal skins, were chased through the garden's labyrinth. Nero did not always participate. Sometimes he simply watched, sipping wine as others hunted for his pleasure. Even when the hunt ended without blood, the message remained unmistakable. Their lives were his games. Despite the horror, a strange silence enveloped the garden. No screams echoed there. Nero forbade them. Those who disobeyed found themselves removed quietly, never to be seen again. The remaining captives learned to communicate with glances, brief hand touches, or hidden signals among the artificial foliage. Hope was fragile, but shared fear forged bonds stronger than chains. The garden's beauty masked decay, both moral and literal. The heavy scents of perfumed oils clung to the air, mingling with something metallic beneath. The plants, though vibrant, were fed by slaves who labored through exhaustion. The fountains, while enchanting, ran red during certain ceremonies Nero insisted were symbolic. Over time, the secret garden evolved from a pleasure ground to a theater of psychological torment. Nero no longer sought entertainment, he sought control over nature, art, and human will. He wanted to prove he could reshape reality itself, and in this paradise built on obedience and fear, he nearly succeeded. Yet the whispers from within would eventually seep beyond its golden gates, whispers that hinted at the emperor's growing madness, marking the beginning of Rome's darkest unraveling. Octavia, daughter of Emperor Claudius and beloved by nearly every citizen of Rome, entered Nero's life not as a lover, but as a symbol. She represented legitimacy, continuity, and the dignity of an empire desperate for stability. Yet in Nero's twisted world, symbols were tools, and tools were meant to be broken. From the first days of their marriage, Octavia lived under a quiet and suffocating shadow, watched, not with affection, but with suspicion. She was gentle, reserved, and disciplined, everything Nero was not. Her composure infuriated him. His advisors whispered that her calmness made Rome admire her more than its emperor, and Nero, already insecure in his own standing, began to see her not as a partner, but as a threat. Every respectful bow to Octavia, every cheer she received in public, chipped away at Nero's fragile pride. By the time Poppaea Sabina entered his life, Octavia's fate was sealed. Poppaea, ambitious and cunning, recognized that Nero's insecurities ruled him more effectively than any Senate decree. She planted seeds of doubt, suggesting Octavia secretly resented him, that she longed for another man, that the people favored her too strongly. It was a campaign of whispers, and Nero, hungry for emotional validation, clung to every poisonous word. Soon, Octavia's elegance was twisted into coldness, her composure into disloyalty. The accusations escalated with chilling precision. First, Nero claimed she was barren, a lie crafted to justify replacing her. Then came charges of infidelity, fabricated from thin air but backed by forced confessions extracted from terrified servants. Octavia had never raised her voice, never acted dishonorably, yet Nero ensured she could not even defend herself. He silenced her dignity before he silenced her life. When Rome heard she had been banished to the island of Pandateria, the reaction was immediate and dangerous. Crowds gathered, chanting her name, cursing Nero openly. Statues of Poppaea were torn down. Flowers were placed before Octavia's likeness across the city. The empire's grief was unmistakable. Nero was stunned, not by their mourning, but by their courage. Their loyalty to her cut deeper than any dagger. But instead of mercy, his response was rage. Poppaea insisted Octavia remained a threat as long as she lived. Nero agreed. Soldiers were dispatched to the remote island with orders disguised as justice. Octavia greeted them calmly, her hands folded, her voice steady despite the terror she surely felt. She asked only one question: "What crime have I committed?" The soldiers had no answer. Her execution was carried out with cruel indifference. Some accounts say she was suffocated, others say her veins were opened. Regardless of the method, Rome understood the truth. An innocent woman had been destroyed because an emperor feared the shadow of her virtue. Her death sent a tremor through the empire, a silent recognition that no righteousness could survive Nero's wrath. Back in Rome, Nero attempted to erase her memory. Her statues were removed, her name forbidden in court. He celebrated openly with Poppaea, believing the empire would soon forget. But the people remembered. They mourned in private, in whispered conversations, in offerings left at temples under the cover of darkness. Octavia became a martyr of purity, and Nero, once merely disliked, became despised. Her death revealed something deeper than imperial cruelty. It exposed a king desperate to control not only bodies, but reputations and legacies. Octavia's dignity haunted him in ways her presence never had, and the empire could feel the shift. Something inside Nero had broken irreversibly. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. Among the many curiosities that drew Nero's attention, few were as disturbing as Sporus, a young enslaved boy whose beauty caught the emperor's eye. What began as admiration quickly became obsession. Nero, whose desires had grown increasingly unpredictable, envisioned Sporus not merely as a companion or performer, but as a reflection of his own imagined divinity, a bride fashioned from flesh, obedience, and terror. Sporus was seized from his previous owners and brought to the Domus Aurea. At first, he was treated with a careful, almost reverent attention. Jewel-toned fabrics were draped over his shoulders, perfume scented his skin, and Nero instructed tutors to teach him the rituals of courtly elegance. Yet beneath this facade of gentleness lay a cruel, irreversible plan. The boy's transformation would be permanent, a grotesque fusion of humiliation, control, and theatrical display. The castration itself was carried out in private, under the supervision of attendants trained to enforce absolute silence. Historical accounts suggest Nero insisted on perfection, demanding that no screams or protests escape. Sporus, stripped of youth and identity in a single act, emerged as a figure both pitiful and unrecognizable. His physical form was altered to satisfy the emperor's vision, his autonomy erased. What remained was a vessel of Nero's domination, a human object designed to embody the emperor's absolute power. Following the procedure, Nero staged what he called a wedding, transforming Sporus into a bride in every ceremonial sense. A procession moved through the palace, with attendants bearing ornate fabrics, torches illuminating the path, and musicians performing pieces of somber grandeur. Senators and court officials, though horrified, were compelled to participate, bearing witness to an event that shattered norms and mocked morality. The spectacle was both intimate and public, Nero's way of asserting control over bodies, appearances, and perception. Sporus's role was enforced with relentless scrutiny. He was instructed in the mannerisms of a wife, adorned in gowns and jewels, and moved through Nero's chambers as if the transformation were complete. Disobedience, hesitation, or visible distress prompted corrective measures. Nero treated these punishments as extensions of performance art, psychological domination masked as ceremonial propriety. The boy's identity dissolved under the weight of expectation, leaving only a living emblem of Nero's caprice. Rome learned of the event through rumors that spread with horror and fascination. Citizens whispered of a boy made into a bride, a human marionette displayed for imperial vanity. The elite feared public censure, yet none dared question the emperor. To defy him was to risk death. And so, the story persisted in shadow, a dark testament to how far Nero's obsession had removed him from empathy, legality, or decency. The transformation of Sporus marked a turning point. Nero's cruelty was no longer hidden behind feasts or gardens. It became an intimate invasion of identity itself. He demonstrated that even the body could be claimed, reshaped, and displayed as an instrument of power. The spectacle was not merely horrifying, it was symbolic. Through Sporus, the emperor proclaimed that Rome itself could be bent to his will, that fear and awe would govern all matters of life, love, and dignity. By the end of this chapter in Nero's reign, the empire could no longer pretend that indulgence and terror were separate. They had fused, embodied in a single tragic figure walking silently through the emperor's corridors, a reminder that power, when unchecked, could obliterate even the essence of a human being. Hidden deep within the Domus Aurea, far from the eyes of courtiers and citizens, lay a chamber of polished bronze, its walls, ceiling, and floor reflective, creating the illusion of endless corridors. Nero called it the Hall of Mirrors. Here, He confronted himself in 1,000 fractured reflections, each echoing his divinity, his power, and, increasingly, his madness. It was a place of solitude, but also of observation, experimentation, and ritual, a private theater where reality and delusion intertwined. The emperor would summon selected individuals, often captives or performers whose obedience had not yet been fully broken. He compelled them to enact stories of gods, mythic punishments, and tragic heroes, their movements choreographed according to his whims. Each reflection multiplied their gestures, turning a single act into an infinite sequence, amplifying humiliation and terror. The subjects, aware that a misstep could provoke physical or psychological punishment, moved with precise, strained motions, eyes flicking nervously between their own reflection and the gaze of the emperor. Nero's fascination was twofold. He studied the human form, observing expressions of fear, confusion, and awe. He also sought reassurance in repetition. Each mirrored performance became a meditation on control, each obedient figure a validation of his ability to dominate reality itself. Yet with every session, his paranoia deepened. He saw betrayal in the eyes of actors who were loyal, conspiracies in reflections that merely imitated his instructions. Even the polished walls seemed to mock him, multiplying imagined enemies into an infinite legion. The Hall of Mirrors became a place where time was suspended. Days blurred as Nero orchestrated tableaux of suffering and divinity, alternating performers, costumes, and props. Sounds were distorted, voices rebounding in strange cadences, further unsettling both captives and emperor. Nero, once methodical, now acted unpredictably, sometimes rewarding obedience with fleeting praise, sometimes punishing perceived errors with sudden, cruel improvisation. No pattern existed, yet every act reinforced his dominion. Within these walls, Nero confronted aspects of himself that Rome never witnessed. He faced reflections that exaggerated his vanity, his rage, his insecurities. He staged reenactments of past triumphs, imagining himself as both god and judge, executioner and savior. The boundaries between observation and participation dissolved. He became actor, audience, and arbiter, trapped in a hall that echoed not only sound but the fractures of his psyche. The psychological toll on those compelled to perform was immense. Many lost track of reality, their gestures becoming mechanical, their identities dissolving in the multiplied reflections. Some collapsed silently, their minds unable to reconcile the endless repetition and scrutiny. Others began to anticipate the emperor's moods, learning that survival depended on reading subtle cues in his expression and tone, rather than acting with freedom or instinct. For Rome, the Hall of Mirrors remained a secret, an unspoken horror known only to those trapped within and the emperor himself. Yet its existence would haunt history, illustrating a ruler whose obsession with perception, control, and divinity became indistinguishable from madness. Nero, surrounded by infinite images of himself, was simultaneously empowered and imprisoned, a man whose cruelty had become inseparable from his identity. By the end of each session, the emperor emerged both exhausted and exhilarated, convinced of his invincibility yet increasingly distrustful of every reflection, every shadow. In that hall, the foundations of his empire and his mind began to crack, and the echoes of mirrors would soon expand beyond the palace, foreshadowing a reign that could no longer contain its own horrors. By the later years of Nero's reign, fear had evolved into instinct. The emperor no longer required provocation to act against those around him. Suspicion alone was enough to seal a life. Rumors of plots, whispered accusations, or the faintest deviation from obedience became justification for disappearance or death. The Domus Aurea, once a palace of opulent indulgence, had grown into a mausoleum, its corridors hiding horrors that few outside its walls could imagine. Senators, once pillars of the Republic, were among the first victims. Accusations of treachery, embezzlement, or conspiracy, often entirely fabricated, were delivered under the guise of judicial process. Nero's enforcers executed these sentences with chilling efficiency. Public trials were rare, The emperor preferred the subtle terror of disappearance, where families waited in vain for letters that never arrived, and homes grew quiet without explanation. Whispers filled the city. Men once powerful, men once untouchable, now gone, erased as though they had never existed. Slaves fared no better. In a single night, entire households could vanish. Those who served in the palace were watched constantly, their movements noted, their loyalty tested in minute details. An inattentive gesture or an unguarded glance could condemn a servant to the secret chambers designed for punishment, from which return was uncertain. Sometimes the condemned were removed quietly and executed in secluded gardens. Other times, their absence was never explained, leaving the palace staff to imagine the worst. Nero's campaign of purges extended beyond individuals to entire networks of influence. Families associated with disgraced senators were subjected to property confiscation, public humiliation, or forced exile. Merchants who provided gifts to fallen officials were ruined, their shops shuttered, their reputations dismantled. The empire became a web of fear, each citizen aware that proximity to power no longer offered protection, only exposure. Informers became the most valuable instruments in Nero's reign. Citizens, servants, and officials were encouraged to report suspicious behavior, real or imagined. Rewards were offered for evidence, punishment for silence. Trust dissolved, replaced by constant vigilance and betrayal. Even those loyal to Nero discovered that allegiance provided no safety. Loyalty was only a temporary reprieve in a world where the emperor's perception was the sole law. The physical palace mirrored this psychological decay. Walls that once gleamed with marble and gold now absorbed the whispered screams and silent terror of its victims. Secret corridors and hidden chambers, designed initially for control and spectacle, became places of execution and disappearance. Nero's obsession with surveillance ensured that no corner remained unobserved, no secret remained safe. The palace itself became a graveyard, echoing the emperor's instincts for cruelty back at him. By the time the purges reached their height, Rome lived in perpetual anxiety. Markets, forums, and theaters thrummed with the knowledge that no status, wealth, or lineage could protect an individual from sudden erasure. Public ceremonies continued, feasts persisted, and the city maintained an outward normality. But beneath the surface, the population was fractured, paranoid, and silent. Everyone knew someone had disappeared, yet no one dared speak. The emperor's cruelty had transcended political expedience. It was no longer motivated by strategy, loyalty, or justice. It had become instinctual, automatic, and comprehensive, a manifestation of paranoia fused with absolute power. By purging endlessly, Nero demonstrated that fear was the most potent weapon in Rome, and that his dominance could be maintained not through respect, but through the relentless anticipation of disappearance and death. In this climate, the empire's foundations began to crack. Loyalty was fleeting, trust non-existent, and the city's elite navigated a world where the next victim could be anyone. Nero's instincts for cruelty had become a force of their own, feeding on obedience, suspicion, and silence, setting the stage for the rebellion that would soon rise from within the shadows. By the later years of Nero's reign, dissent had seeped into the farthest corners of the empire. Governors delayed commands, generals hesitated before executing orders, and even ordinary citizens murmured their disdain openly, though cautiously, in the shadows. Nero's authority, once absolute and unquestioned, faced fractures that multiplied with every ignored decree, every whispered insult, and every defiant act. Rome had begun to recognize the vulnerability of the Golden Emperor, yet Nero remained trapped in his illusions of divinity. The first signs of rebellion were subtle but unmistakable. Provinces delayed tribute, citing logistical challenges that were, in truth, veiled refusals to obey. Legions stationed in distant territories hesitated to march at his word, unwilling to participate in campaigns they no longer respected. News of mutinies filtered back to Rome, carried by messengers who risked their lives to report defiance in safe terms. Nero, hearing of these events, saw betrayal in every messenger, and paranoia festered further, driving him deeper into the Domus Aurea. Inside the palace, Nero surrounded himself with sycophants, men and women who praised every action, exaggerated loyalty, and minimized dissent. These attendants were carefully selected to reflect only what Nero wished to see. They acted as mirrors of obedience, validating his sense of invincibility while concealing the storm building outside. Yet even these courtiers could not fully contain his growing fear. The emperor paced long corridors, restless and sleepless, observing shadows as if they might betray conspiracies. The halls of gold, once a symbol of his dominance, had become a gilded cage. In Rome, conspiracies formed quietly. Senators who had survived earlier purges now plotted vengeance, recruiting military officers and provincial allies. Citizens whispered of secret councils and covert alliances, planning to reclaim a city suffocated under tyranny. Though disjointed and cautious, the network of rebellion demonstrated a singular truth: Nero's reign depended less on allegiance and more on fear, and fear was losing its potency. The emperor responded with sporadic cruelty. Minor acts of defiance were punished with sudden executions. Entire households could vanish for imagined treachery. Yet the more he lashed out, the more the empire recoiled. The vicious cycle of fear and paranoia intensified his isolation. Generals refused summons, governors ignored commands, and even the city guard hesitated when ordered to enforce imperial will. The illusion of control became fragile, splintering at every point of resistance. Nero's psyche mirrored this unraveling. His delusions of grandeur persisted, yet every whisper, every hesitant gesture from subordinates reinforced a growing sense of entrapment. Once a god in his own eyes, he now resembled a caged animal, pacing the labyrinthine halls of the Domus Aurea, flanked by mirrors reflecting a ruler increasingly consumed by dread. Loyalty had become a performance, obedience a gamble, and the very structures of power. The palace, the Senate, the army, now seemed aligned against him. In these final days, the collapse was not sudden but inevitable. Each act of defiance, each delayed command, and every murmured conspiracy eroded the emperor's confidence and authority. Nero's isolation intensified, his appetite for control now a desperate attempt to stave off the consequences of his own cruelty. The golden god of Rome, once feared and adored, was trapped by the very empire he had sought to dominate, cornered by the shadows of rebellion he could neither quell nor escape. The stage was set for the final unraveling, a confrontation between a once mighty emperor and the consequences of decades of unchecked tyranny, where power, fear, and madness collided inescapably. The Domus Aurea, once vibrant with music, laughter, and the murmur of obedience, had grown eerily silent. Torches flickered against golden walls now dimmed by neglect and fear. Outside, the murmurs of rebellion had transformed into open defiance. Governors refused to act, legions no longer marched at imperial command, and the Senate had declared Nero an enemy of Rome. The emperor, who once moved through these halls as a god among men, now felt the weight of mortality pressing upon him with relentless inevitability. Nero's final night began not with ceremony or indulgence, but with panic. Servants had fled, leaving chambers empty and corridors deserted. Sycophants who had once mirrored his every whim vanished, abandoning the emperor to the vast hollow palace he had built to assert dominion. The golden halls, adorned with mosaics and frescoes celebrating a reign that now seemed grotesque, reflected a solitary figure whose power had evaporated, leaving only fear. Every echo reminded him that the empire he sought to control had turned against him. He moved through secret passages, corridors twisting like the labyrinthine logic of his own paranoia. Mirrors lined some walls, reflecting his gaunt, desperate face back at him, an image he could neither ignore nor escape. The reflections were merciless, multiplying his panic, exaggerating every flaw, every tremor of doubt. For the first time, Nero confronted a reality he had long denied. He was not divine, invincible, or immortal. He was alone. Outside the palace, the sounds of revolt crept closer. Crowds gathered, their voices unified in anger, chanting, shouting, demanding justice for the years of terror that had suffocated Rome. The soldiers who had once enforced his commands hesitated, then fled, leaving gates unguarded, corridors unpatrolled. Nero realized that resistance was futile. There would be no triumphant escape, no loyal hand to protect him. Death awaited, and the golden prison he had constructed offered no sanctuary. Desperation drove him through familiar chambers, past gardens that had once displayed captives as ornaments, past banquet halls where dignity had been shattered, past the hall of mirrors that had amplified both fear and power. Each space, once a testament to his control, now mocked him with echoes of the cruelty he had inflicted. He had created Rome's most spectacular theater of terror, yet it now staged only his own downfall. As he reached the outer gates, Nero found them barred by empty air. No guards, no allies, no hope. The streets of the city were no longer silent with obedience. They were alive with fury, each step of the populace, a reminder that his reign had ended. Panic surged, not just for survival, but for the first time, for the realization that death is absolute, and the empire would not bend to his will. In his final moments, the emperor abandoned pretense and grandeur. His breath came in short, erratic gasps. He stumbled into a small chamber, clutching at anything that might serve as protection against a fate long denied. History would remember the fall of Nero, not as a battle, not as an execution, but as the quiet, pathetic panic of a man stripped of all illusions. Alone, he faced mortality in its purest, most terrifying form. The palace, emptied of life and laughter, remained behind him. Its golden halls, once filled with suffering, spectacle, and obedience, now stood silent, a monument to cruelty, ambition, and madness. Nero had fallen, and Rome, scarred by fear and oppression, bore witness to the cost of one man's unbridled desire for control. The forbidden palace, in its final stillness, became history's judgment, a silent testament to the dangers of absolute power and the enduring echoes of terror left in its wake.